we're going to talk about several topics. Now, for some of you, these concepts and topics may be new. For some of you, you probably have some things you could add. So all of our knowledge is going to be different, but I'm going to try to really focus on what are those cultural identifiers that our clients or students may have that impact the job search. I want to really give a good definition of unconscious or implicit bias and how it impacts or intersects with job searching. And hopefully we'll get a chance to review some strategies for helping clients through overcoming bias during the job search. I like to start by helping you to understand why this topic means so much to me. I work at the University of Baltimore, and we are the most racially diverse institution in our system, the University System of Maryland. And because of that, I have all kinds of students from all kinds of walks of life on my campus, which I love. And what I've learned is I've gone around campus to talk to them. They have a lot of anxiety about job searching, not just about the process of job searching and interviewing, but will they be received during the employment process? And it got to the point I started hearing the same questions over and over again. And I realized that my team needed some training on that. And that really just built into beginning to share it with other groups. That's really how I've gotten here today, is by focusing on meeting the needs of my students. Number two, because my institution is the most diverse in our USM system, a lot of employers target my career center because they feel like, oh, well, I don't have to go to the historically Black college, and then I don't have to go to the PWI, the predominantly white college, because if I come to the University of Baltimore, I will get a good, healthy mix to support my diversity hiring or to ensure an equitable process. And what I have learned in that process is, sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the back, it's a 10, he sounds like a monster, but he's 10 pounds, he's a Yorkie. So I have learned in this process that a lot of companies will come to your fairs and say they have these diversity initiatives, asked to meet with different groups, whether it's the LGBTQIA or the Black Student Association or what have you, but the culture of their company is not inclusive. So I have really learned to be a gatekeeper for my students. And we have found that we have to educate, first ask good questions about culture and what diversity means to a company, and then sometimes educate companies on what it means to eliminate implicit bias from their process, to understand that students have a fear and anxiety about discrimination. So that really stirred this pot for me. And then my own intersectionality. Obviously, as a Black woman, as a woman, I'm also a parent. And at one point in my career, when I was very young, I became a manager or a director at a younger age, and that played a role as well. So in my work now, even though I'm at a diverse institution as far as the student population, unfortunately, our staff and faculty diversity is not as evident. Sometimes I'm the only person of color in a room. It has been very interesting. Sometimes I'm still the youngest person in the room. And from the balloons, you'll see I celebrated a milestone birthday last week and I refused to take the balloons down. So that's why they are still up. But all of our identity intersects. And what I have really learned is that this weighs very heavily on students. And I've also learned that all recruiters and employers are not practicing fair and equitable recruitment practices. All right, so I know we don't have a lot of time because of the size of the group to do a lot of interacting. So I took out a lot of the interactive piece, but when I do this live, it's very interactive. But I do want to ask one question, if some folks feel comfortable sharing in the chat. Has a student ever expressed concerns over hiring discrimination or the need to minimize a cultural variable to you? Yes or no? Yes or no? Just simply type yes or no in the chat. And I'm going to glance at the chat. Oh my goodness. So far, oh my gosh, look at all these yeses. Wow. Oh my goodness. Thank you guys so much for participating. Yeah, John, you're right. Unfortunately, yes. So what I'm learning is that we haven't been talking about this topic as an industry, but we're all experiencing it from our students. It almost makes me want to cry a little bit because you all know, if you've ever been in a job searching is stressful as it is. But then to have to question your identity and should you hide it or not and how it will be received, if you could just imagine the burden that must be on some of our students. So here are some of the questions that my students at my campus have asked. Should I wear my hair natural? And in this session 2 days ago, I had a student who had lovely dreadlocks, beautiful dreadlocks. And she said, should I cut these off as I begin to look for employment? And it blew my mind. So this is a popular one. Should I change my name on my resume? So I actually have a family member who felt her name was a little ethnic and she doesn't use her name on her resume, or a transgendered student, right? And their name on their resume. And it sounds like the speaker before you, I caught the end, talked a lot about that for the trans community. Will my resume date me? So on my campus, we do have non-traditional students. So I have 20-year-olds, 30, 40, 50, 60s, and maybe some 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds on my campus. And I'll tell you, especially in the graduate student population, I think once you hit your late 40s into your 50s, you really begin to face ageism. Ageism is an ism, and it's real. And we don't talk about it as much in our culture because, the truth be told, American culture values youth, right? So a lot of folks, once they cross this 15-year mark in their career, or 20-year mark, or when they hit their late 40s, because I also write resumes, they really start to grapple with, should I take my dates off, right? So that people don't assume or get hints about how old I am. I've had students, because our institution is in Baltimore City, and I've had students say, should I leave my zip code off of my resume? When should I request an accommodation? One of my favorite groups to work with are students with disabilities. And part of that is because our director of accessibility on our campus is so awesome. So she and I have forged a great partnership, and we actually reach out to her when we're working with students with disabilities and they have some roadblocks. So one of the things that she and I discuss all the time is making sure students with disabilities understand their rights, understand what employers can and can't ask them, but also understand when they should ask for an accommodation, and realizing that the law requires reasonable accommodation. And for international students or students with English as a second language, how do I minimize my accent? This is an area I really dove into about 4 years ago when we started really doing outreach to international students. And I'll tell you what a colleague pointed out to me is that when you have an accent, everywhere you go, the first question people ask you is, where are you from? Can you imagine that being the first question people ask you all the time, as though you don't belong, right? Where are you from? So students with an accent can also have a lot of anxiety around the job search. I'm sure if we were live, we could add to this list. I also worked at a Jesuit institution and had students want to know, can I wear my cross as well? Someone just added in, when seeking internships, non-traditional students have been concerned about being accepted. Thank you so much, Victoria. Absolutely. This list, it can just go on and on here. And it's a sad list, but I'll tell you this, you want to know these things from your students. You want to know what their anxieties are about their identity in the job search, because that's the only way to help them and be able to have those discussions. So before we jump into the strategies, I need to paint the reality, because all of us are different and we come from different walks of life, and we might not even be aware of some of the role that bias plays in the job search. So first and foremost, the EEOC, or the Equal Opportunity Commission, tracks these types of cases because discrimination, fortunately, the Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate on the basis of certain cultural variables. And those who feel that they've been discriminated against and choose to file reports are tracked by the EEOC. So I do have another question for you all. Looking at this list, age, national origin, race, disability, and sex, which one do you think has the most cases filed with the EEOC? And I believe this was the 2019 report I pulled. Which one has the most cases filed? Okay, I see age, sex, disability, another sex, race. Okay, so a lot of people thinking sex and disability. I got another race. Okay, awesome. Thank you for those who jumped in quickly. Let's look at this. Here's the 2019 report. Race, and then yes, disability. So my group that I did this for a few days ago was so surprised to see disability so high on the list. And I think that a lot of people, unless you work and really have talked and heard the stories of persons with disabilities, don't realize it can be a hard place out there in finding employment. sex, which you heard a lot from the last speaker, age, and national origin. Here's the thing. These are only people who report it. This number is probably really higher, right? The people who have faced discrimination in some part of the workplace, from hiring to promotions to firings, is probably a lot higher. These are just the people who were offended enough or felt compelled enough to actually file a complaint. So just some food for thought. The other thing I think is so important, if any of you on the call are from employer relations, or work with employers, bringing them in to talk to students and clients. Yes, I'm looking at last name Dixon, maybe Trezette. Age, you're absolutely right. We don't talk about ageism in our culture a lot. What we also don't talk about when companies come to our campus is, do they have diversity policies? Are the companies we're bringing to campus diverse in their hiring practices? And there's a great article, Why We Logged Every Fortune 500 Company Diversity Data or Lack Thereof, by Stacey Jones and Grace Donnelly. And they found in 2017, only 3% of companies were actually fully transparent about the demographics of their workplace. Now, whether it's just because they weren't sharing them or they didn't know, is to be told. But what they recommended in this article is that companies who profess diversity should have some of these components: a diversity page on their website, a diversity statement, EEO1 report. So companies of particular sizes have to report EEO1 data to the federal government. They should know the gender, race, and ethnicity of their workforce, and what you'll find is that that data may be full or partial. But this is important because when we send students to companies, we want to ensure that our students will find inclusive environments, particularly our underrepresented groups. We have a company that is is a Fortune 500 company that really does a great job trying to hire from all the colleges in Maryland. I think they do a great job with that strategy. But they struggle on our campus because they assume that our students want to work for a Fortune 500 company. Well, I have a lot of first generation students. They just want to work. It doesn't matter who they work for. They just want a good job. So they really fail to attract them on campus because they're working out of a privileged mindset about how to recruit our students. And we've had to talk to them about that. The other thing I talked to this company about is we've sent students who've gotten jobs with them, and half of them leave within a year because they did not find the environment inclusive. So I have learned the specific type of student who thrives at that company, but it is an inclusivity area. And these are things for those of us in employer relations or who work with employers and bring employers to campus for fairs. We should be asking these questions. We should even really include them in the applications, because what it does is it advocates for the student, and it gets employers who say they want college talent. It forces them to think about the inclusivity of their hiring practices and their company cultures. One of the laws or trends right now that I am so proud of that really impacts a lot of our students, especially if you have African-American women, is the anti-discrimination hair laws that are popping up across the country. So today I wore my hair natural for you all. I went natural back in 2013. For those who don't know, natural simply means that I do not relax my hair or do anything to straighten it, though I may blow dry it. Thank you, John. He gave me a hand clap. And I'm going to be downright transparent and honest. It took me years to feel comfortable wearing my hair natural to work out of fear of being judged. Okay? It took me years. Now, I'm also going to be honest with you guys. When I do wear my hair like this, I do have some white colleagues who ask to touch it. And Eileen, I love that face you just made. You were like, what? Yes, people have asked me to touch my hair, whether it's braided or what have you. I do it for students, number one, because they need to see someone like me in my position being true to my identity and know it's nothing wrong with it. But I have learned to accept the questions, because I think as long as people ask questions, we can all get to a place of global fluency. So the anti-discrimination hair laws are popping up around the country. There's a great group called the Crown Coalition. Write that down. If you are not familiar with the natural hair movement in this country and what persons of color have faced because of natural hair, whether it's policies about a uniform or grooming. We've heard tons of stories about students in middle and high schools being asked to cut their hair, being sent home or suspended for wearing their natural hair. This is a real thing, people. I am so happy to announce that many states, and actually I found an article yesterday, there are more than this. My state is one of them. The state of Maryland have either introduced legislation or in the process of introducing legislation to prevent hair discrimination. Ours in the state of Maryland is called the Crown Act. And basically it says you cannot discriminate against people in the workplace who have hairstyles that are closely associated with racial, ethnic, or cultural identities. Look it up if you don't know about it. I can't tell you how many classrooms I've gone in, and I believe as a Black woman, I've had students who just feel comfortable asking me, should I wear a wig? Should I take my braids out? Should I straighten my hair? And I've even had, and I want to share these and then move on from this slide. It's also not just a Black issue. I had a white student come in one time, and she had purple hair. If you're not familiar with Baltimore, we're the Ravens. We like to rock our hair in different colors in Baltimore. It's our thing. I think it's very cool. But she had, it was blue or purple hair. And she came in and asked me, should she wear a wig to cover up her hair color? And then I have an employee who is a white woman of Italian descent, beautiful, long, curly hair. I love her so much. And at her previous employer, which was in a different county, it was in a different county than Baltimore City, she came in one day and my employee had her hair curly. It's a natural curly wave. And she said, oh, did you not get a chance to go to the hairdresser? Why is your hair curly? And to this supervisor, straight hair, even for white women, was more recommended over curly hair. The curly hair was looked at as not being refined, I guess. And for the 4 years that my employee worked at this institution, she straightened her hair every Sunday. And this woman has hair halfway down her back. Can you imagine the stress of that? So I just want to point out that it's not always a racial thing. No problem. I appreciate being transparent. I see folks are putting links in. So please do continue to pick up on some of these resources that people are putting in here. I could probably talk about hair discrimination all day. As I told you guys, I'm just getting over really my own stress around hair in the workplace. Another issue, and this is a service we recently introduced on our campus. I work with one of our negotiation faculty members very closely. She brings us into the classroom to talk about salary negotiation. So it's really forced me to dive into research about salary negotiation. I hate to remind us all, but in America, there is still not equity as far as gender and salaries. This is a job search issue, because if our students do not know how to negotiate salaries, we are not going to be able to move the page on fair and equitable compensation. In America today, women make $45,000 to a white male's $55,000. Black women make 62 cents to the dollar of a white male. Hispanic women, 54 cents. Asian women, 89 cents. American Indian or Alaska Native, 57, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 61 cents. It's not equal. Not only is it not equal to the male dollar, it's not equal within the underrepresented group categories of women. This is crazy in this country that we are still not seeing everyone is worth the same amount. And the law actually prevents this. There is the Equal Pay Act. The problem is that it's hard to fight this because on most of our companies, we don't share salary. It's something that's taboo in our culture, right? Besides some state and federal agencies, salary is kept very, very private. If you don't do this on your campus, particularly for women, we are missing the mark. We should be teaching women how to negotiate salaries on our campus, because there are some students, particularly first-generation students, who tend to struggle with efficacy and esteem. And I know this because not only was I first generation, but I'm studying this for my dissertation. They will take anything because they just want to get their foot in the door. But we can't push the needle on this if we don't challenge it. And the way to simply challenge it is that they need to know how to negotiate salary in an interview. And it's something that they need to practice. So we're actually offering that as a service in our office now, where students can run through a simulation of that. And there are other issues. You guys already talked about LGBTQIA. Family leave and parental policies are still an issue for people in the workplace. Women in the C-suite, international students also face bias in the workplace. The list just goes on. And for the sake of time, I can't go through all of them, but I did want to pick out some of the areas that have really been in the news lately. So let's now talk about bias. What is this topic of implicit bias or unconscious bias? Well, I have a great training I use for my freshman students because I teach our freshman seminar from Paperclip Communications. And if you want to introduce global fluency, because it is a competency on the NACE career readiness competencies to your students, and you don't have time to really build a curriculum, Paperclip Communications actually has several really good curriculums under diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're not very costly. And then you can pick the topics and the subject matter that you might be able to infuse into your services. But implicit biases are the attitudes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And the reason implicit bias is such a concern is because it's unconscious. We don't even realize we're doing it. We all have implicit bias. The key is to be aware. Multicultural competence, right? To be aware of this, because these biases can create these favorable or unfavorable connections with certain groups. So for instance, someone comes into my office and tries to get a job and they say, I'm from Baltimore. And I say, I'm from Baltimore. And I give them the job. But what about the poor other candidates who were just qualified but weren't from Baltimore? So implicit biases can be both positive and have positive and negative impacts, but more than anything negative because it causes exclusion. It's not very inclusive when we're operating on our implicit biases. There are also different types of implicit bias. And again, for the sake of time, I won't go through each of these. The one I will explain a little just so you understand that there are different types is beauty bias, because it relates to interviewing. We all know if you train students in interviewing, you are judged within the first 60 seconds, right, of someone meeting you. This is why we talk about Dress for Success. Beauty bias and who we find attractive can be a very unconscious or implicit bias that we all hold and will show preferential treatment to people. And I will never forget years and years ago when I used to watch 2020. If you guys remember, Barbara Walters used to come on Fridays in 2020. They did a study one time where they had women, I think they did it for men and women, but they would have candidate A stand on the side of the road, car broken down, hood up, all that good stuffing. The first person would be your what would be considered your ideal beauty standard, right? Long hair, light eyes, slender. And then the candidate B would be different, a different body type and different look. And the study found that more people stopped to help the first person, the person with that was, the society standards of beautiful. And I was like, wow. And I've never forgotten that we will go out of our way to help someone, not even realizing it, or not help someone unconsciously because of the way that they look on the outside. The studies have also been done about teachers in the classroom. And if they perceive a child to be attractive, they tend to give more favor to that student. So, and discipline them harder if they don't perceive them to be attractive. And again, we're human. Implicit bias is a part of who we are, but you must be aware of it. To have a multicultural society and multicultural competence, you must be aware of your own implicit bias. So implicit bias really runs on assumptions and generalizations. Whoops. And if we had time, I would love to really go into assumptions and generalizations. I think is a very good topic. And we have a lot of fun with this with our first generation students of talking about assumptions and generalizations. But I wanted to share this slide because these are things I've seen. One is from Instagram, one is from LinkedIn, to go to help us see in real time, in narrative form, meaning the stories of real people, how this implicit bias is playing out in our society. This first one, DM Mooney, I do not know him. I am now connected to him on LinkedIn. When he posted this, it just struck me so much. He posted, what does a psychologist look like? This is a man with a PhD. He has his own counseling business. He actually does a lot in the world of diversity and inclusion. And if you were to ask him, if you saw him walking down the street, would you think he was a psychologist? And the answer for most of us is probably no. Probably no. And I thought this was so great because for all of us as career practitioners, what does any career look like? And who determines what a career look like? These are the questions we have to start asking ourselves, to break down some of the barriers. The other one was on Instagram. And again, I do not know her personally, but this woman has her hair in a short, what we would call probably a short natural hairstyle, a short afro. And she goes, shout out to the people who told me I wouldn't be able to keep a broadcast news job with a short natural haircut. Joke's on you. So think about that as one of your students, that people in their career, after they've studied for 4 years or 6 years, tell you, unless you change the way you look, you won't be successful in a job. Just let that sit with you for a little while. And this is a slide I've added in. I had to add it in because I was challenged in this myself. We've started a career closet on my campus and we love it, but we ran into a challenge when it was time to organize it because of gender. How do we break out the sections of the clothes? And then it took me deeper as I begin to think about dressing for success. And I really begin to question, and I'm still questioning, what is professionalism? And who gets to say what's professional? And you guys, I have come to the conclusion that professionalism is a privileged concept. This tears me to my heart because if anybody's been the biggest advocate and will tell a student to be professional, it's me. But I'm starting to really realize that we need to work some of the bias out of professionalism. Is it more qualities of the professional and characteristics like honesty and career readiness, or is professionalism a look? Is professionalism a hairstyle? And I'm afraid in some of our industries, it's still a look and a hairstyle. In some other industries, it had really broken out of this, and they do look for the character and the competence of performance instead of how a person looks. But I'm afraid we still have our work to go here. I wish we were in a room to talk, because I would want to sit here for a minute and get your thoughts on that and how you train on what professionalism is. But if there's any question I want you to leave thinking about from this session, it's what is professionalism? Who gets to say what is professional, and where are the limits? Where's the gray space? Because we do have to help people find employment and we want them to be successful, but do we want it to be encroached in privilege, encroached in the dominant group, encroached in standards that aren't real for a multicultural society? All right, let's now shift from implicit bias to talking about those cultural factors that really are impacted by implicit bias for our students. And I'm not going to read these off. You can look at this list, but everything we talked about earlier, these are the things students worry about. And one of the ones we didn't mention was even body image or lookism. Obese persons are discriminated against in the world of work. And actually, if you haven't heard of the Harvard implicit bias study, Harvard, you can Google it, and you can actually take surveys and assess your own implicit bias on different categories, whether it's race, sexuality, gender, obesity. And every year I have my freshman students do this, and I'm actually going to have my staff do this at our winter retreat. But we all, no matter what our backgrounds, have some part of our identity which could possibly face unconscious bias or implicit bias during the job search. The good news is that there are some categories or cultural variables that are protected under the law, under the Civil Rights Act: race and color, sex, including pregnancy, age, national origin, religion, disability, and genetic information. The hard part is that implicit bias is very hard to prove. Very, very hard to prove. Just like the topic of microaggressions, another thing that's very hard to prove. So there's good protection under the law, but because it's such an individual subjective area, it can be very, very hard to prove. The parts of the job search which are impacted by implicit bias, and there are probably more. These are ones that I have really experienced students having concerns about: are the resume. Names on the resume, dates on the resume, student group titles. Maybe you belong to the LGBTQIA or the Jewish Student Union, because those speak to your culture. You're letting people and giving them an inkling of who you are culturally right then and there, just from that document. And I am a professional resume writer. I do that in my business. And I don't think the resume is the best way to screen for candidates. I really don't. I actually think the federal government has somewhat of a better process that tries to eliminate bias in hiring than we do in other sectors. Interviewing, obviously, once you're in an interview, most of the visible cultural variables are going to be in front of you: race, some ability or disability, and then there are hidden ones that won't be, such as mental health, and gender sometimes even. So it gets to be a very interesting situation to see how these cultural variables come to play. Social media, because many employers and everybody's on social media, they can look you up on LinkedIn. Your wardrobe speaks to you, right? In how you dress. Some cultures, their wardrobe is a part of their culture. I had a Jewish student ask me about that earlier this week, and the yarmulke and things that they that they choose to wear to celebrate their culture and religion. It plays a part in networking. First of all, it's accessibility, because for those of us who work with first generation students, they might not even have a network. We realize on our campus that networking means two things for our students: building a network and then working your network, because you can't work a network if you don't have one. And most students that are first generation don't have that kind of social capital. So that's an accessibility issue in and of itself. But definitely when you're networking, implicit bias can play a role as you're getting out there and meeting people, and how people perceive you and who they choose to connect you to. And then even the career exploration process. This was brought up the last time I did this live, and someone said, some students don't even know how to go about job searching and exploring because they don't have access, and they aren't given access because when they're going places, they aren't given the same kind of attention or resources. I will challenge most of us to say, on your campuses, particularly if you're on a predominantly white campus, are you reaching out to your special populations? On my campus, we have special career guides and outreach to students with disabilities, veterans. We do special programming for women. If your underrepresented groups are not coming to your office, stop saying we just need to do more flyers and marketing, and start coming up with real strategy. There's actually a great checklist I found this year on career centers and diversity and inclusion. And it's a checklist that you can do with your staff to see how DEI is playing a role in your office. If you want that checklist, connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email and I will send it to you. My staff, we did that, and we're about to build some strategic priorities for DEI into our strategic plan at our winter retreat. And then for the law, there are oh my goodness. First of all, look at this slide. These are really all the parts of the hiring process and workplace process where employees can face discrimination. So even though they get the job, we oftentimes, once a student gets the job, we're not as involved, but they can continue to face implicit bias when it comes to promotions, when it comes to dress codes on the job. There's just so many areas when it comes to wages and so forth. So these, of course, are areas where there should not be discrimination. And on our campus, we check every job posting that comes in. We have created a scalable process where we can do that to try to weed out anything that is not fair and equitable. It's also a good training opportunity. Some of the reasons that implicit bias gets a free run in our hiring process in America is because on the employer side, resume expectations are not consistent. So employers have all kinds of expectations of resumes, and students don't have access to the same type of career services. So if you have international students and they're not coming to your center, they're not going to have the same advantage that students who are coming to your center are going to have with the resume piece. That's why we got to reach out to these special populations. Recruiters and hiring managers are not trained well in bias and multicultural competency. And I think we have an opportunity as career professionals to do this. So my staff this month, we have contracted a professional in a nonprofit that we work with to actually do a training for all of our employers on implicit bias and diversity hiring. If you have interest in that, reach out to me, because I want to see that spread across the country. Some companies don't even have a diversity initiative. Some companies still haven't caught up, to modern day. Managers, the people who actually make the decision, are not always trained on fair labor standards. And because of that, they ask our students illegal questions. And again, we have that whole unconscious piece where implicit bias happens in such a quick 30, 60 seconds, and it's unconscious. On the student side, students don't always know how to brand themselves well. They don't know how to make these decisions about their diversity variables on their professional documents. They may not even be aware of their own multicultural competency. So when they face these things in the workplace or in hiring, they can't even name it, right? They can't even quite put their finger on what just happened and how do I respond to an illegal question. They have a lot of stress and anxiety, which impacts their ability to job search and their ability to perform well in interviews. They don't have knowledge of fair labor standards. And if you and your team are like, wow, I don't even know all the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Pay Act, make that your next special project for your next training event in your office, is to learn more about those. And some students do suffer from imposter syndrome, so we don't have time to get into it, but particularly if you're in a predominantly white institution, any of your underrepresented groups are going to go through identity changes. I went to the University of Maryland at College Park. I definitely went through identity changes because I was the only brown face in some classrooms, and it was scary to me. But by the end of it, I went to College Park because I wanted to be around diversity. And now most of my time has been spent being an underrepresented person, but I love the diversity of it. And I love educating people about my culture, but also about the fact that people are individuals, right? And you can't just look at everybody as a group. Let's see here. You guys have so much stuff rolling in the chat. I want to give us enough time to at least ask some questions, but please look at the chat and grab some of those links because people are sharing some very cool resources. I'm going to grab them, I know that, to add to my toolbox here. So students who are going through identity changes and not quite confident, they don't have the efficacy and esteem, may really experience imposter syndrome and feel very uncomfortable when they're going through the interview process. It's such a real thing, and it's such a stressful process to be going through. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I want to get to the strategy piece, but I do have to mention intersectionality and the fact that some of us fall into multiple groups, right? You could be a Black man who has a disability. You could be a white woman who identifies as LGBTQIA. So all of us have these intersecting identities. Some parts of our identities takes more precedence in some places and time and space, but it's not a singular focus. And I feel like in America, sometimes we make it all about race. But for me, sometimes in the workplace, being a working mother or parent has been the harder piece. I will never forget when I first, one of my earlier jobs, my child was an infant. I was the only employee with a child. My supervisor didn't even have a child. And I will never forget this one colleague of mine, and she and I are good friends now, but she would make comments every time if I ever had to leave work early when my child got sick. And to this day, I am so cautious of how I use leave because I'm always thinking if my child gets sick, I'm going to have to take off. So I'm not going to take vacation. It's not always a racial thing. There's so many other pieces of our identities that play a role and can face unconscious and implicit bias. I don't have time to go through these concepts here. Oh my gosh, this is such a rich topic. The three I want to point out is cover. When you're talking to a student about their fear of sharing or not sharing a cultural bias, what you're talking about is should they cover? They're asking themselves, should they hide a facet of their cultural identity to blend in with the majority group? I want to point out emotional tax because I want to remind us that when we are preparing to face implicit bias or navigating the process of facing implicit bias, it causes stress, and it is an emotional hardship. And then I want to point out weathering because emotional tax leads to weathering. Weathering is the long-term stress involved with navigating discrimination. It weighs on you mentally, emotionally, and can have a physical impact. So I just want to remind us of that mental health piece that also plays a role with each individual that might face some type of bias, whether it's coming out in the workplace, whether it is I'm a parent in the workplace, whatever it could be. So in my last few minutes, I really just want to spend 5 minutes going over some strategies. And my goal is not to provide you with a bookload or a checklist of strategies. My hope is that you all will dive more into this topic. You will think about the students on your campuses and develop your own strategic plans, hear from them, do some focus groups, and then help sit down as a team and come up with how you're going to help students navigate this, because each situation is very individual. But the one thing I do like to share is every individual has a choice of if they reveal or conceal. You do not ever pressure a student. My student with dreadlocks, if she chooses to cut them off because she feels like she doesn't want to deal with implicit bias, she wants to have the most opportunity, fine. If she decides to keep them and that she wants to wrap them up in kente cloth, fine. It is her choice. And I always just tell students, just think about the pluses and the minuses of the decisions you're going to make. And it's unfortunate that we have to do that, but we don't face a fair world of work. But please remember, they have to make that choice on their own, okay? The second thing we teach students is to think past. So for instance, if an employer asks a legal question or they're concerned about one of their cultural identifiers, is to think past the cultural identifier or the question to what is the concern the employer might be asking. So I'll point out two of them. If you are a working parent, the concern might be, are you available, right? So sometimes some people choose to fight implicit bias in their legal questions. And if they were to come across an employer that they feel aren't being fair, they might actually just come out and say, you just asked me in the legal questions, or am I being discriminated against? Some people are just fighters, and we need fighters. Others of us aren't. And I'll be very honest with you. When I was in undergrad, I unfortunately faced a hate crime. Someone wrote the N-word on my dorm room door my freshman year. And I didn't want to be out there in the newspaper and talking about this because I was so emotionally distraught myself and trying to navigate that space. I'm more vocal now because of my identity development. So, you know, it's very much up to an employee to decide in that moment, I don't like this company because they are clearly not inclusive, or what is this employer really asking me, and let me answer this in a way so that they understand, yeah, I have children, but, you know, my schedule is open and available. I have, you know, support, and hopefully you won't, you can also choose not to mention your children, you know, in an interview. But I think for some people, they feel like my children play a major role in my life, and I want this employer to know that, but I also want them to know that I am going to be available. So really teaching students how to get to some of the root concerns that employers may have. If we were in live in person, we would actually do some breakout groups and talk about them, but I can't quite do that with our time constraints and our setup now. I tell you, COVID just throws a wrench into everything. You also need to coach to overcome bias. First and foremost, with students, especially students who are different from you, where you don't share the same cultural variables, say that they're concerned about how they were treated or something, acknowledge the client's concern, even if you feel that the student is more so heightened because of past experiences, or maybe they read into it. I will say, I do think students who have experienced bias, regardless of the category, tend to be heightened emotionally, and you may have a tendency to think everything is bias or discrimination, and it may not be, but acknowledging where people are in their pain is very important in this process. Help the client face, again, that underlying concern. Help them identify and select the right strategy. So I don't just blanket tell my students, take your date off, take your, you know, Hispanic student union off. We have a conversation, because I think it's for one thing, one of the NACE career readiness competencies is global fluency. And this is a perfect time to help educate and get our students to be in touch with their identity and think about global and cultural fluency. Point them in a direction of inclusive companies. Your first speaker did a very good job sharing some of the LGBTQIA resources out there. This is the same for women, for students with disabilities. There are companies out there who are very committed to diversity hiring. Students who are veterans, working mothers. Do your research and point them in the directions of these types of companies, and invite these companies to your campus. And practice the responses with your client, especially if you notice a student has low self-esteem or low self-efficacy, because I'm gonna tell you this, just talking to them is not gonna help them show up well in interviews. Our employers, a lot of our research on our campus in my office came from employers telling us that our students were awesome. They tell us, when we hire your students, they're great, but in the interview, they don't sell themselves. So we have a big strengths initiative in our campus. We do a whole badging program around strengths, because number one, diversity variables are good for the workplace, right? This is proven. It is proven that diverse companies perform better because you have more different perspectives at the table. But here is the kicker. We have to teach our students how to articulate the value of their diversity. I'll tell my students right now, though, first of all, my students inspire me so much because I have students who have been helping take care of their family since high school. They know how to hustle because they face so much adversity. That's a strength. But if you're not confident to sell it as a strength, then it's not going to come across as well, especially it's not going to come across for your advantage, especially if you're dealing with an employer who doesn't have a diverse perspective. I'll tell everyone I worked 2 jobs to get myself through college. And that was a strength because I came out with a good GPA. So we have to encourage our students to sell their diversity. You can speak 2 languages, that's a strength. Don't be ashamed of your accent. This is a strength. As you can see, I'm very passionate about this. I could talk about it for a long time. Okay, we're coming up on the end here. Let's see here. I think I'm going to skip over this one. And let me actually, for a second, I want to jump to one last one because of the time is just whittling down here. I want to jump to this slide here. I hope you guys are enjoying this topic. The last thing I just want to say is I want to encourage us as professionals, and I want to encourage us in our offices to make sure we are multiculturally competent. I wanted to put some resources up for you. I talk to a lot of young professionals. I love talking to younger professionals, and I realize that they don't know about a lot of standards and competencies. And maybe that's because we moved away from counseling, and I am not a licensed counselor in our industry, but we want to make sure we still are aware of standards. So ACA does have American Counseling Association does have a multicultural counseling model. NCDA, and I am so happy to, I don't know if you guys know, but I am the president-elect of the National Career Development Association, so I really have to pump us up here. But we have NCDA minimum competencies for multicultural career counseling and development. They're actually being revised right now, so the new ones will be coming out really soon. I'm so excited about that. And then NCDA has a knowledge series providing career services to multicultural populations, and actually it's a downloadable series, and this presentation is actually a part of it. So if you're like, oh, I got a colleague who really needs to hear this, you can actually go. I'm not sure what the cost is, but it's very affordable. And examine your own unconscious bias. We all have it. When I'm with my students in freshman class, we do a really good activity around bias, generalizations, assumptions, and stereotypes. But it starts with you. It starts with your office. And then it starts with engaging employers in this conversation. I have enjoyed talking to you all. I don't know, John, if I have 5 minutes to take questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to you and go